Begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Praise Him and thank Him and ask Him to bless Prophet Muhammad and his family and companions and all of us with them, Ya Rabbil Alameen. I think the title of the banquet kind of says it all, and it really says everything that I want to say, and that is the power of one. Because at the core of effective and successful grassroots work is an understanding and then an application of the understanding of the importance of individuals, and not only because those individuals ultimately make up groups, but also the society, but because there's an intrinsic value that Allah, God, has assigned to every individual, regardless of their race, religion, or otherwise. A friend of mine who works in law enforcement was talking with me about some of his struggles and the difficulty of attempting to be effective in such a troubled industry. And he told me a story that many of you have probably heard about, a kid who was on the beach and he was trying to save these starfish. There was a bunch of starfish that had been washed up on the beach. And there's some 3 miles or so of beach full of starfish. And so this man comes up and he says to him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm trying to save the starfish." And he said, "Well, you're never going to be able to do that because it's, there's 3 miles of beach full of these starfish." And then the boy picked up one and he threw it in the water. He said, "Well, there goes one." Right? That if all you can do is affect the life positively of one person or change misunderstandings of one person, that in that is a tremendous value. As someone who's lived on both sides of this conversation of understanding and on opposite ends of the bridge, as someone who I remember during the first Iraq war as a kid, not only having feelings of confusion and misunderstanding, but honestly feelings of hate about Islam and Muslims, because of the propaganda machine and because of the things that we've heard alluded to in the talks before this one, and having gone from that to being audacious enough to convert to Islam, and then having been very fortunate to have lived amongst the Muslims both here and abroad, I know very well both sides of that conversation. I remember a friend of mine calling me, a colleague, and talking about her challenges with dealing with the broader community and dealing with people from outside of the Muslim faith community and their understandings about Islam. And she kept saying, they say such and such, and they have these feelings, and we do such and such. And she kept talking about them. And at the end of the conversation, I said, the interesting thing is that I feel like I'm both us and them. And I know what it means to be both us and them. And see, this is part of the problem, and really at the core of what Jahat was sharing with us is an otherization of the Muslims, an otherization of the Muslims individually as people, and then ultimately as communities. The issue, as we have heard so clearly and authoritatively and very graciously and humorously presented, the problem is that misunderstanding has taken on not only an institutionalized but an industrialized body. And it has become an industry to make people not only misunderstand, but ultimately hate Muslims. And when misunderstanding is institutionalized, then clarification must by necessity take on an institutional body. I was reading in The Economist some years ago, it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, a conversation about Islam and Islamophobia. And in that article, they highlighted that the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary has a master's degree program specifically dedicated to converting Muslims to Christianity. A master's degree. Now, granted, it was The Economist. It wasn't, some crazy blog or some Muslim conspiracy theory thing. So, I took it at face value. But I actually went on the website last night and looked up the degree and looked up the areas that are covered, and I was floored. I mean, it looked like they were trying to go to Zaytuna College or something. I mean, with the level of Arabic that people expected to know, and the level of understanding of Islamic law. And this is dedicated specifically not to build bridges of understanding, but to get people to jump ship, right, and to ultimately leave Islam. So this has taken on an institutional body. And so what does it mean for us? It means that we have to respond with institutional fortitude. As important as the individual is, I think it's a very dangerous assumption to just think that things are going to get better, just naturally. And obviously, there's nothing like the power of prayer and positivity and optimism And I appreciate you ending, although the Bugs Bunny thing, you confuse me, but I appreciate you ending on an optimistic note. You know, we have to have institutional fortitude to respond to these problems. And this is why ING is so important. One of the things that stands out for me is this idea of standardized training. And I'll just give you, I haven't actually had the fortune of attending the speakers training, but I've benefited vicariously from people I know that have. And I'll give you one example of a powerful, powerful tool that ING, I know historically has imparted to its trainees, and I know I've benefited from it. But it's the idea of framing, an idea of using appropriate language. And something that I have employed from as soon as I heard it is the idea of, instead of using non-Muslim, saying people of other faiths. Something very, very profound. And there's, I think, a time and a place when you have to maybe call a spade and talk about Muslims or non-Muslim. But in terms of how we engage people, and when we're talking in front of crowds of people from other faith communities talking about Islam. I was at one of these college MSA things, and there was an award. They did like a raffle. They're always trying to be creative, how to make it fun and what have you. They don't have Wajahad Ali, so they have to improvise. So they had a raffle and it was when the gas prices were really high some time ago. And it was a free gas card, and it was like all of the different names were put in the thing, and then they pulled out names, and so the person comes up and they announce a raffle and they say, well, the good news is that the Muslims and the non-Muslims have their names in the raffle. And no one really felt anything, but you could feel this unease in the room because of the inappropriate, I would argue, use of that word. And then some guy, John or whoever, ends up winning the raffle. And so when it comes time for the announcement, the president of the MSA goes, "Oh, those lucky non-Muslims," right? And you think, now, some may say that that's kind of a no-brainer, but we so often are insensitive in that way. And this is a type of work, see, it's not just Islamic literacy, but it's cultural, social, and emotional literacy that ING is imparting to the people that it trains. Now, you could look at a number of less than favorable situations where people are not adequately trained and are attempting to build bridges, but because they haven't been trained, they're often doing more harm than they are good. And if you wanted to talk about that, I could keep you guys here till Fajr. But I'll just tell you two brief stories. One, you guys remember Rob Davis, I think it is, the chief of police in San Jose? Davis, is it, right? Fasted with the Muslims 2 or 3 years in a row. He was invited to the home of a dear uncle who called the police department, said, "May I speak to the chief of police?" He's put straight through. He invites him to his house for iftar, and the chief of police shows up to the iftar. Of course, he was on time because, right, the Muslims are, right, we're even late to iftar, right? He said he was the first person to show up, and he comes in, and he's just hanging out with the crowd. And there was another uncle, a friend of mine, that said, "Hey, can you bring some of your convert friends so that the chief of police can see some of the diversity in our community?" So we showed up, and I'm thinking the whole time, because I grew up in San Jose, my family's an old San Jose family, I'm thinking if only my friends could see me now, right? Chief of police. So it's time, and it was a Pakistani home, so they had iftari, and then they had the dinner was delayed a little bit. So, the chief of police goes up to the front of the line, and he gets his plate, and then he sits down. There was a young man sitting next to him, just kind of an anecdote here, sitting next to him, and the chief of police had like a pakora or something left over on his plate, and the kid says, "Are you going to eat that?" True story. And he's like, no, go ahead, right? So, and I'm sitting there like, I'm going crazy because I'm like, oh my God, there's the chief of police. Like, you're not supposed to ask for pakora, right? But then something happened that I think speaks to the problem. And that is this assumption that we know what we're talking about, or that if we know what we're talking about, that we are thereby licensed to talk about it whenever we want. Can you imagine? Chief of police. The guy's fasted 3 months with the Muslim community. He's definitely done his part, I would argue, in building a bridge. So what's now the first conversation that's going to come from the Muslim community at this dinner? Auntie sitting to my left, auntie sitting to my right. And if you're here, auntie, I love you and God bless you and may Allah protect you. I'm not picking on anybody. I just want to talk about a real situation that happened. Totally benign, innocent, but you see the implications. Auntie to my left says, "I don't know what this whole imsak thing as you guys do in your country. We don't do that. Imsak meaning leaving a little bit of time before the dawn prayer in the morning during Ramadan. And the auntie to my right says, no, it's very important that you do that, and it's part of Islam. And they start going back and forth. Now, you talk about Islamic literacy, the fact of the matter is there's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars about that thing, and they happen to come from one country where a particular legal methodology was dominant. They come from a different one, so they have different cultural norms. But this is the first conversation happening in front of the chief of police, and he's just sitting there totally dumbfounded, like, what are you guys talking about? And then from across the room, you have the proverbial Muslim with the solution, who says with a mouth, no, this is a true story, with a mouthful of food, I think it might be a hadith, it says something like such and such, and this is where our community historically would have been humble enough to just pause and to just say, I don't really know what the thing is, or to speak intelligently. Because see, the issue is, those 43 or 46 million dollars they're not going just in vain. Those are people that are studying seriously about Islam, and they know about Islam. And if people who are adherents to the faith aren't speaking intelligently about the faith, it's a major problem. And this is, again, why ING is so important, because of social, cultural, and emotional literacy. Another story, and I won't bore you with too many stories, but another one, because I think it speaks directly to the work that ING is doing. I was invited to a private school, a school called Drew School in San Francisco, upper echelon, it's an expensive school, and one of the teachers called and asked us to come there and to do a presentation about Islam, and I think it was a freshman and a sophomore class. And I came, and the kids were totally bright, and we connected, and it was really, it was a big learning experience for me. But the teacher told me afterwards, she said, I'm really glad that you came. I said, why? She said, we called the local mosque. I don't know which mosque it was, and I don't know who the imam was. So I'm not picking on anybody. This is what the lady told me. She said, we called the local mosque, and we had this gentleman come out, and she said, I just didn't understand, because he came in the room, and he wouldn't even look at any of us. He wouldn't even make eye contact with us. And then he told the kids, basically, if you don't all become Muslim, you're going to go to hell. No, we should be weeping to think that our religion is being represented by people that, however, they may have understanding about Islam, but they're culturally, socially, and emotionally ignorant. And so this is the work that ING is doing, is shifting that. And the issue is that when it comes to people's sensibilities, this question goes from the grassroots at the school level all the way up to policymakers. On the way in here today, and my wife can tell you, I was on the phone with my older brother, who's a commander in the U.S. Coast Guard. And he called me and said, look, not tonight, but this is a previous conversation. He said, I'm on the review committee with the Secretary of Defense about the whole Fort Hood thing. And he said, you would be shocked to know how ignorant some of the policymakers that are affecting things that will affect your community are about Islam. He said, and there's a lot that we have to learn because this is the thing, it's not just these kind of what some may assume are exceptional situations. The unfortunate thing is that without organizations like ING, without specialists that are trained, people putting their foot in their mouth in the name of religion is unfortunately not the exception, but it's become the rule in a lot of communities, right? And so the problem is that's one thing if you're talking to a room full of high school students that may well go on to become policymakers. But it's another thing if you're talking to people that are immediately going to be making decisions that affect the future, the present and the future of our community. So I can say with absolutely no hesitation, without any type of, this isn't some type of nicety, that this is work that we have to think seriously about investing. One of the most exciting things to me about the time that we're in is that we're in a time when the Muslims are really starting to invest in their institutions. And we should be very careful as a community, particularly in the Bay Area, to ever feel for a moment like, oh my God, another fundraiser. You should be very careful because number one, it reeks of some assumption that the money's actually yours. And Allah gave it to you. And Allah blessed you. And Allah has gifted this community with so much. But the second thing is that it reeks of a real misunderstanding about the intergenerational survivability of Islam in this country. We're not going to survive without the proper establishment of institutions. This necessitates an institutional response. And I'm very, very honored and excited to be part of what ING does and to support this organization. And I hope and pray that, inshallah, this evening and all of the future endeavors of ING inshallah, we'll be blessed, and that it will continue to be a means of not only increased understanding, but increased bridge building and ultimately increased love and conviviality for us and for our brothers and sisters in humanity. Ameen. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.